Hello, everyone, and welcome to 180 Degrees of Impact. My name is Matt Scott, and this is, I guess I could say maybe the third time's the charm for our connection, but I'm here with Billy Ward. How are you doing today, Billy?
Doing well, man. Thank you for having me. It's an honor to be here with you, and I'm humbled with the invitation that you had sent me to be here today. So thank you.
No, it's an honor to have you, and I think a lot of people will have uh, questions about. I mentioned earlier about your background, everything that's going on, about your shirt, Seton Hall Prep, and one thing we were saying before getting started was that I was really struggling whether to call you Billy, whether to call you Mr. Ward, because about 12 years ago, probably when I first met you, it was Mr. Ward. And for about 4 years after that, when I was at the prep, it was Mr. Ward. But you reassured me that I could call you Billy. So I'm going to stick with that for this conversation.
Awesome, man. And it's interesting. And I've always kind of like when people call me Mr. Ward at Seton Hall Prep when I first started here 20 years ago, I'd be looking over my shoulder for like my old man. And, I love, to a little certain extent, I love seeing guys struggle with, should I call you Mr. or Billy? It's kind of funny to me. But the evolution is that, we started off as teacher and student, really. And you've evolved and I've evolved, but now it's more of a teacher-teacher, student-student relationship where we're kind of both committing to, the same path. And so I think with the evolution, it's important that we are able to recognize each other in our names, So
Yeah.
Billy, Maddie. So this is the way it should be.
Yeah, and I appreciate it, and I'm glad that we could be here. And that, yeah, you're right. There is that relationship evolving, and so, currently, right now, we're here, and this is the state of it. That you are, other than that teacher-to-teacher relationship, you are also an interviewee as part of 180 Degrees of Impact, and so I'm excited to dive in and not only learn more about just you and your story and your philosophy, but also just to share that with anyone who is watching now. And so, I would love if, as we get started, if you could just talk about how do you, I know that we've talked a little bit about, who you are, but how do you typically introduce yourself to people when you are giving talks or when people do ask you to introduce yourself?
It's funny. It's a really good question, Maddie. And a lot of times, I don't introduce myself. I just delve right into my story, and I might at the end talk a little bit about where I've come from, or even after a talk when people are coming up and we're talking more intimately or one-on-one. But when I think about that question, who am I? Like that's a deep question, and one I think we could all reflect upon a little bit. And I think the first thing that comes to my mind when you ask me who am I, it returns immediately to my family at home. And I think my first roles and the most significant roles that I'm playing right now are being a husband to my wife and being a father to my two boys. Beyond that, here at Seton Hall Prep for the last 20 years, what a blessing to be in an institution that is in almost complete alignment with what I value. For example, we just instituted a character development program where we're introducing 4 pillars to the community. And those 4 pillars are family, faith, compassion, and courage. And I certainly want to embody those pillars at home with my wife and my children. Here at school, I've taught for a number of years. I direct the Kairos Retreat, which is kind of like, along with Mrs. Rondinella, the thing that we really love the most here, because it's been such a vehicle for teaching young men like yourself about the power to love themselves, others, and God. I have a private practice outside of school where I do some counseling. And then, as you had mentioned, I give some talks. So I do wear a lot of hats, but it all kind of falls under the auspices or the umbrella of spiritual development, personal development, and kind of like living your best life now. I would also say, as I talk a little bit more, I really love life, and I like people, and I kind of get a kick out of it. And I think from a very early age, I recognized that we only kind of get one shot at this. It's not a dress rehearsal; it's happening right now. So I try to make it fun, and I try to enjoy it, and I try to take it one day at a time. And that philosophy and that approach has really garnered a lot of peace, freedom, joy, and love for me, which, you know, are things that you really can't buy, but are priceless, just priceless.
Yeah, and I think it's amazing. You really said a lot there, and I'll also say just from the experience of hearing from you and talking with you in a lot of different contexts over the past 12 years, I think that whatever you say, I feel like with this recording, people need to rewind and listen again because there's a lot of depth there, and that's one reason I want to talk with you. Like you mentioned that you only have this one life, and one thing that's really fascinating to me about your story, other than just the message you have to share and what you put out into the world, is that you interact with students all the time. And I mentioned being at the prep from I guess 2006 to 2010, but I mean, you've been there even before that, and you've been meeting all these people. And so I just want you to know through this conversation, even though I'm asking so many questions, is that, you clearly have this, this impact around you. And I think it's great, the work that you're doing. And so I just wanted to shout that out before diving in more to any other questions I have.
I really, Maddie, it doesn't go unheard. Like when students send me feedback or personally tell me in person, I really am humbled by that. But it's also tremendously affirming because, like any human being, you can have some doubts about yourself and the work you're doing. But it's interesting here at the prep, like I'm receiving a lot more than I'm giving. And I get so much from being with the students and their families and our faculty that I owe it. I have a responsibility to give a little back to the community that really gives so much to me. And I really, really mean that. I feel like incredibly blessed to be able to come here. And I don't even call it work. I come here to kind of play every day. And to teach and to be present. But it's an easy place to show up to because of the people like yourselves and your family that I get to interact with on a daily basis, which is what a blessing and an opportunity.
Yeah. And just to start out, I guess, I'd love to dive into more of how you ended up where you are. And I know a bit of that story, but I would just love to start out, I guess it's not really from the beginning, but to go back, how many years has it been that you've been at the prep at this point?
This is my 20th year.
Oh, wow. 20th anniversary. So perfect timing for this interview. Congratulations.
Thank you very much. And in all honesty, prior to the year starting, I was like at the town pool the last day of the summer swimming with my little guy. And my little sons, they're very interested in the prep and they're here a lot. And so they're always asking questions. And my oldest, JD, said, "Dad, how long have you been there?" And I was like, "This is my 20th year." And he almost just like, he was so in awe of like, you spent 20 years there? And as we got talking, I was just like, man, how lucky am I that I love where I get to go every day. And 20 it's a big number. I never thought I'd be here this long. And here I am, and it's a beautiful thing. And I'm kind of looking at this year as a big year with a lot of good stuff going on. So thank you for that, Maddie.
No, thank you. Thanks for all that you're doing. And just to go back, I know, you've shared your story. There is a TED Talk or TEDx Talk, TEDx Foggy Bottom, which I'm so excited to have happened. And we'll talk about that a little bit in a moment, I'm sure. But like to go back even further than that, when you were in high school yourself, or when you were in college, what were the different pieces of like what you studied or how you spent your time that ultimately built up to where you are now? So like, how did you build the foundation for the work that you're doing?
Interesting, really good question. I've thought a lot about this and where it comes from. Growing up, I was always really moved by those people that were nice. And I think from a very early age, because of the experience I had with nice people and the inspiration I experienced with them, I decided very early on that I wanted to be a nice guy. I knew that I wanted to make people feel good about themselves. That idea then coupled with my athletic experience As I moved through high school, I started to kind of pair them both up, and I was really kind of going to use football as a vehicle to share this message, which eventually has turned from being nice to being loving. So as I went through college, I had kind of secretly inside of me this singular goal to be in the NFL. And I wanted to play quarterback, and I was dreaming big, and every day I was trying to align the way in which I prepared towards that goal. Now, I didn't walk around with a billboard saying, "Hey, I want to go to the NFL." It was kind of like something I kept inside of me. But
Yeah.
every morning in college, I woke up, and as my feet hit the floor, they slipped into sneakers, and I laced them up, and I started running right through campus. This is outside of even the normal everyday training, so I was really, really pushing for this, and with the idea in the background that this was going to be a vehicle, potentially the NFL, to share this message, this platform of the importance of being kind. I had a little cup of coffee with the Baltimore Ravens after college, which was an incredible experience. And I spent a couple of months with them up until the last cut. And I felt like a little kid in Disney World. And I felt comfortable, and I felt like, hey, I've done it. Now we start the road to kind of being a starting quarterback in the NFL. And then the last cuts came, and they released me. And I got to be honest with you, it was a long ride home, crying and wondering, who am I and what am I going to do? And I found myself at working at a camp, volunteering that fall with disabled adults. And I had talked to the director of the camp about my desire to go back to school to study psychology. I grew up with a dad who's a psychologist, so it was always kind of like in the back of my mind, and growing up with lessons about life from him, or experience he would share with me from people he was working with. And as I talked to the director of this camp, who happened to be a teacher, he suggested that I apply to Catholic schools in the area and then maybe go get my degrees for free at Seton Hall. And I was like, I didn't know that was possible. And not having a lot of money in my pocket at the time, I applied to some schools in the area, and I got a call the next day from Monsignor Kelly here at Seton Hall Prep. And I was just overjoyed at the opportunity. And it's funny, you go from the NFL to Seton Hall Prep, and you figure, oh, that's got to be a big disappointment. And I got to be honest with you, the first time I walked into a classroom, I remember it like it was yesterday. In fact, before I walked in, one of the faculty members said, "Excuse me, sir," as I was going into the faculty bathroom, said, that bathroom's for faculty only. And I was like, I am a teacher, and I meanwhile, I probably look like a senior in high school. But I walked into that classroom, and that first step through the door, I felt like I was almost stepping back into a huddle. And in football, the huddle was something that I just tremendously valued. A pack of guys kind of standing together in uniform, talking about what they're about to do. And as I walked into the classroom, it felt like that kind of intimacy. And again, I was kind of like the guy calling the plays, but now I wasn't calling football plays. I was talking about how to maybe approach this life as a man of integrity, as a man of faith, as a man who really wanted to be kind. And so now that I've been here 20 years, I can tell you, when I look back, getting cut from the NFL was probably one of the best things that happened to me, because it gave me the opportunity now, instead of using the NFL as a vehicle, Seton Hall Prep and this institution became my vehicle to teach kindness, which in turn, as I evolved, turned into, let me teach these guys how to love. Let me teach them that the most manly thing they can do is really to share the love in their heart. And that to me has been the most rewarding thing, dropping these seeds of love with students like yourselves, and then seeing guys like yourselves carry that message to their friends, to their families, to strangers, and to the world that they're about to enter. And that's probably been the most rewarding thing that I've gotten to witness as a result of some of the stuff that I think I'm really making an effort to put out there in terms of being kind and being loving.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think it's really interesting to hear just kind of the journey a little bit more, because I don't think I've ever really heard that, that idea of you stepping into the classroom, and you have mentioned calling the plays in this different way, but I think it's really fascinating. I think of like my own experience now being, it's kind of crazy, feel like I've been gone from Seton Hall Prep for a long time, but it's 8 years. I'm 26 now, and like I go into high school sometimes now to do different talks or speeches for whatever reason, and the one thing I wish is that I just had more time with students to be able to really engage with them and get through to them. And I think that's one thing that's so powerful about your experience, even more than like the NFL, is that you have this captive audience of people who not only who you could speak to, but who have the benefit of hearing from you, which is really something that I think is really cool about the work that you're doing and underrated about like teaching overall, to be honest.
No, I absolutely agree. And it's funny, I relate to what you're saying in terms of how I feel about my son's teachers now. And, my son last year, he just finished the first grade, and he had this teacher that was like Mrs. Collins. And she was just so amazing. And the impact that she had on my son, like I couldn't, in my own words, tell her like in an appropriate way how grateful I was. Like I would have been looked at as if I were weird. So what did I do? I just said, thank you so much for all you've done. Like we appreciate you so, so much. Even in my own history, I remember, Maddie, my first grade teacher, I had Mrs. Talley, Mrs. Hagan, Mrs. Robeno, and then Mrs. K. That's first through fourth grade. Like I remember them like yesterday, and the impact that they made on me and the gift that they gave me by the way that they chose to show up every day, which is similar to like when I was a little kid, when I saw people show up and be kind, I just noticed that it didn't seem to take a lot of effort. And you gave somebody a little bit of yourself. The impact was so exponential to the effort you had to put in. So it's been some journey here, and one that I am really grateful for. And the opportunity to teach and to learn all at the same time is an amazing place to find myself in at this point in life.
Yeah, one gift that I feel like you've given, at least speaking, I can only really speak from my own experience, but one gift that you've given me is not only just being present and time, because time is a very important thing to give to show that you're interested in students, I think. But the other thing is you mentioned Kairos earlier, and I went on a couple of Kairos retreats when I was a student, and you shared your story, and you spoke about Daniel, and that's also the premise of the TEDx Foggy Bottom talk. And so I'm wondering if there are like any stories like that the story of Daniel and your relationship with him, and of course with Leah, and now your two beautiful children. Any stories that you want to share overall, just in terms of your interactions with students?
Well, it's interesting. I talk a lot about Daniel because Daniel and my relationship with him really embodied kind of what I have now. This student-teacher relationship that goes beyond just the classroom, where it becomes more of a brotherly relationship, a mentor relationship. And I think with Daniel, like I just saw so much goodness in him, and he really taught me a lot about being authentic in the moment, having fun, and just being loving.
Are there any stories in particular that stand out to you from your work with students?
Wow, there are definitely tons of stories. I feel like my tenure here, my experience here, it's a collection of stories. Every day there's almost a story I could probably share or go home with. If I think in general terms, I think the story that excites me most right now is I bring my two sons and my wife to a lot of activities, games, events, barbecues. And what I love most now in terms of where I'm at in relation to the prep is when I bring my two sons and then I see a couple students that I've worked with on Kairos or in class go over and start interacting with them, either having a catch or shooting a hoop or just sharing an ice cream. That's when I'm like, this is coming full circle for me, because the guys that I'm trying to really care about, my students, are now really caring about my sons. And that like almost gives me goosebumps. It's just like, this place is not just a school, it's a family. And it's it's much more expansive than just even your 4 years. You know, it's a community and a family that you're a part of for a lifetime. But for us faculty, what a privilege it is being able to watch students come in as young boys and leave as young men. Like that evolution and that development, not only physically but spiritually and emotionally, is such a gift. But the thing that really gets me these days is watching students with my sons and watching my sons look up to them, and it's a beautiful thing for me to witness and to see.
Yeah, that's really amazing. And I think, it's really a testament to who you are and the message that you instill in them, and the message that Leah's, the message is that I'm sure many, many messages that you're instilling with them, you and Leah. And one thing I want to kind of ask about, just thinking about those stories, I've mentioned TEDx Foggy Bottom. You gave a TED Talk or TEDx Talk, Love and Be Loved. And for me, one thing that was so stunning about that experience is I remember I don't even think I had a ticket to the TEDx event that day, but I said, you know what, I need to see this one talk. Like, I need to get to class before and after, but I need to see this talk. And I sat down, and the piece of the talk that I want to talk about, which I'll never forget, was at like the 10-minute mark of your talk, is that you mentioned how, I believe the date of the talk was February 7th, 2014, which it was the anniversary of the subject of your talk, which was Daniel, of course, who I know has been such an inspiration for you. Like, could you talk a little bit about how, could you reason through for me at least, like how that coincidence takes place, how that comes up, and what that was like for you to be able to deliver that talk on such a significant day for you?
Well, it's there's a lot in there, Maddie. First and foremost, similar to the last question, having been invited to TEDx was really born out of my students, you. So, I'm trying to teach kindness and love here at Seton Hall. Then you go off to college and you hear about this TEDx you work on, and then you say, hey, by the way, I have a teacher. I remember getting a call from a gentleman down there who was directing this.
Yeah, Brian Doyle.
And he said, hey, would you be interested in giving a TEDx talk? And I'm kind of like thinking on the other line, does anyone say no to this? I'm like, I've been watching TEDx videos for 10 years. Of course I want to jump on that. But then he told me where it came from. And it just seemed to be in sync with what I was doing, and it didn't surprise me that I had this unbelievable opportunity that was really born out of my relationship with my students. Then when he told me the date and how that kind of lined up with Daniel and his passing, it seemed like that's the story that I had to tell. And I wanted to, not to be sad or dark, but I wanted to express something to the audience that says, Daniel's light and love could be found in everyone. And during the talk, I believe I talked about that idea, looking for the goodness in others, and that kind of really points to this idea of gratitude, right? We have a choice individually to seek the goodness in others, to seek that little piece of God in others, or if we don't become more conscious and aware of that idea, we can often default to kind of judge and to separate and to look for what's missing or what's wrong. And I've just found in my own life, life is a lot more enjoyable and a lot more fun and a lot easier to connect with others when you're looking for that goodness. But the TEDx opportunity, coupled with the date and Daniel, it just all seemed to be so synchronistic in terms of the date, the ask, the event. And again, I was just incredibly humbled to be able to have the opportunity to deliver that message. And then like the icing on the cake was, you go out and you deliver this message. And then afterwards, I had like 8 to 10 Seton Hall Prep students waiting for me by the side door and like high fives and congratulations. But it was kind of like me. I did something. I was able to come back home right there in that moment, even in Foggy Bottom, DC. Yeah. So that is something that I will always look back on fondly. And just what a gift that whole experience was, and still is to a certain degree, right? It's still out.
Absolutely. And it's the sort of thing where it's I mean, like YouTube, it's the gift that keeps on giving. It's something that's still out there. And I just looked again today and I'm thinking, what's going on here? Like there's like almost 3 million people have, or 3 million times your talk has been viewed, which I think is surreal for me, having, heard that talk in a room of maybe 50 or to 100 people, students, and then that, now we have people all over the world who are hearing your message and appreciate it. And so I think it's so important that you could put that out there. You talked about gratitude though, and you've talked about the idea of love and be loved. I'm wondering, what advice do you have for people to actually embrace those things? Because it's a lot easier said than done, I would assume. But yeah, could you talk a little bit about what advice you actually have for people to live out those messages you were talking about in your TEDx Foggy Bottom talk?
Yeah, I think sometimes, Maddie, I think change is overwhelming for people. And when I talk to people about change, I talk to them about making little steps, and little steps become big steps. And one of the examples that I've been using lately is, you brush your teeth every day, probably, right? You brush your teeth in the morning and maybe at night. Some people really, they get after, they start brushing their teeth at lunch, which is great.
Yeah.
But you think about it, you brush your teeth for maybe 2-3 minutes twice a day. Think about the impact that has on your health over time.
Yeah.
And it's like, all you're doing is twice a day for 2 minutes. So in alignment with that idea that change can be done a little bit at a time, I think sometimes people are overwhelmed that I can't do that, I can't change. And what I'm saying here is, start with some little things and decide right now what you want to do and how you want to get there. And you have to start creating ways in which to cultivate that sense of what you're seeking.
Yeah.
So for instance, in the morning, I used to look at the morning as being a pain in the ass. I'd have to wake up, a lot earlier than I had to be at work, getting the boys ready, making breakfast, making lunches. And after a few weeks of being miserable doing that, I was like, wait a second, there's a different way to do this. There's always a different approach. I think recognizing as a human being, we've always have options, and we get to decide what options we take. But there's always options out there to do something a little bit differently. So what I do and what I do in the morning now is I enjoy that time. I make a decision when I wake up that I'm going to make the most of the time that I get to spend with my family before I go to work. It's not just a time period just to, check the boxes. You brush your teeth, you got your shoes on, you got your lunch. But this is a time for me to really be present with these guys. So I think it's little things like that, taking a look at your life and seeing, hey, where are some things that maybe I'm not operating at such a high level, or where are some things that I'm doing that maybe I could do a little bit better? And I kind of always look at how much peace, freedom, joy, and love am I experiencing? And if I'm not experiencing a satisfying amount, there might be options to do something a little bit differently. But I think all in all, I think you have to decide, but then you have to act. It's cool to say, hey, you want to do this, you want to do that. But as the Quakers say, you got to really pray and move your feet. So I really do believe in action. But going back to the brushing the teeth, it doesn't have to be overwhelming action. It can be little bits and pieces of action that eventually create a big impact.
Yeah. What do you usually say to people, like, to continue with the teeth brushing analogy? Like, you might have some students who say, man, Mr. Ward, I just didn't feel like brushing my teeth today. Like this morning, I haven't felt like brushing my teeth all week. Like, what's that like for people who, or what's your advice, or what do you say to people who have hesitations or doubts about, being able to develop that routine?
Well, if we're talking about brushing your teeth, I will say, well, what are the consequences, Matt, of not brushing your teeth? And you might start to think about, some consequences, maybe, that bad breath, might have trouble connecting with people, cavities down the road, right? Going to the dentist, pain, and now finances. So I try to take a look at what people are doing, but also make them recognize that they are in some ways a part of the results that they're getting. And if they want to change the result, that yicky feeling in their mouth or the cavity, well, then they got to change the action at the root of that cause. So there are only so many things we can control in this life, but one of the things that I do believe we have the freedom to really control is us and how we choose to respond to things, but also how we behave and operate on a daily basis. And we really want to consider the results that we're getting in terms of the actions we're taking. And if we're not getting the results we want, we got to understand that we have some ownership in that. We got to take responsibility and accountability for that. And if we want to change it, we got to go back to the core and change some of those action steps.
Yeah, I think one thing that whether you're talking to people who are totally on board with what you're saying or people who are skeptical at first, one thing that is really powerful is that there's this whole idea that we all have this ability to make a difference about in how our life is going and in what we're doing. And I guess one other question I have before getting to one of my final and favorite questions is just like, what are some of those challenges that you see in living your truth and living that life of compassion and courage on a daily basis?
Well, I think as you get older, it gets a little easier in terms of knowing who you are and how you want to be. One of the most beautiful things that I've read about Jesus is he knew how he was going to be before he entered the room. And that's like total evolution, right? Regardless of what's going on in that room that I'm about to enter, I already know how I'm going to be. And when I read that, when I experienced that in other men and women, where they have this energy about them, where they seem to be at peace no matter what's going on.
Yeah.
I really aspire to kind of be like that, knowing that I'm an imperfect being and I'm going to fail at times. But I struggle like everybody else. I have good days and I have bad days, bad weeks or little funks that you get into. And what I think I try to do the most when I'm getting into a funk is I try to spend some time with people that I really like. And I try to duplicate what they're doing in the moment. And I share, hey, dude, I'm struggling. And sometimes that openness and that vulnerability lends itself to a connection with another friend that is able to say, hey, I've been there. And then all of a sudden my perception kind of expands. And then I'm able to get back onto that train of spiritual development. I find the more that I work there in terms of raising my own consciousness, the better I feel. And really at the top of my pyramid in terms of what's really important, it's quality of life. And so I try to align a lot of what I do towards that. And you mentioned earlier about just time in general being such a commodity. And I really, really believe that. And so I try to look at my week and I have like a healthy equation for the week. Things that I do every week that give me the most peace, freedom, joy, and love. And I look at it from a mind, body, spirit perspective. So what does that mean to you in layman's terms? Well, I go to yoga 4 or 5 times a week. I hang out with a buddy or a group of friends at least once a week. I go out with my wife on a date with friends or just by ourselves once a week. I'm always reading something that has to do with spirituality or personal development. I'm always watching something. I watch a show or a TV show or two. Last night I was watching This Is Us. The show gets me every time. I just love it. I spend a lot of time with my family too. I pray and I meditate. So those are kind of the things that I do every week. And if I get to the end of a week and say, man, I had a really shitty week, I take a look back and say, hey, what did I do or what didn't I do? And a lot of times it falls back into that healthy equation. And as I've gotten older, I've gotten a lot more consistent with that, what I need to do personally in order to not only step into the best version of myself, but to enjoy it and to have fun with it.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think it's interesting because I'm thinking about your routine that you mentioned, and like, there are so many different pieces. I don't do yoga every, however many times a week. Right. And, I think everyone needs to figure out what works best for them. But I think what you're pointing to in general is you have to make time for that self-care. You need to make time for, loving others and loving yourself. And, before even getting to my last question, that's one thing that I think I mentioned earlier, and I think I could just repeat this again and again. But one thing that I think is unique about your story and you is just that you make that time for people. Like one thing that came to mind for me earlier in the interview is just like the last time I saw you I think I was in that exact office. It was right after my dad passed away, and you had like such wise advice and a lot of your own love to share. And I'm one person, and I'm just imagining how much love you have to give. You have a lot of different responsibilities, a lot of commitments in your life, but I think like just listening to you, there's a message in you have to make time for people. It might not always be easy, but you need to make time for, time with your buddies, time with your wife, time with your kids, time with yourself. And so I think that that's really cool that you do that.
It's interesting, Maddie. I'm almost like teary-eyed hearing you talk. And sometimes as a teacher, you don't ever really know when the seeds you're planting are going to come into fruition. Sometimes they come to fruition right in the moment.
Yeah.
You get the message, hey, thank you so much for talking to me. But sometimes you don't. And I think you got to be okay as a teacher with that. Recently, I got an email from a student that's a fifth-year senior in college, and he sent me an email in September, and he said, hey, I finally get what you were trying to convey when I was in high school. And I was kind of like, yes. I'm like, you got it, doesn't matter when, but you kind of awakened up to this idea that we have the power to not only love ourselves but to love other people. And then hearing you talk a little bit about your own experience with your dad and showing up here, and I thank you for recognizing that that could possibly happen a lot for me, and it does. And I'm honored that people allow me in. My uncle's a priest, and I remember one of the things that he said to me. I asked him as a young kid, I said, "What do you like being about a priest so much?" And he said, "I get to kind of get into people's lives at the most significant times in their lives: births, deaths, baptisms, confirmations." And in a lot of ways, I feel like so humbled and privileged and blessed that I get to be invited into the lives of my students, the triumphs, the challenges, the good stuff, and the challenging stuff. And what an opportunity for me to learn a lot about this life, but then to share a lot about what I'm learning in these intimate relationships with my classes or with my audiences is really almost kind of like a responsibility that I feel like I have. I'm not sitting here saying, hey, I got all the answers. I've just been blessed to have a lot of really good experiences where people like yourselves have opened up to me and have given me some insight into that human condition or that human spirit, and how triumphant it is at times, and how at times we do hurt and we do experience pain, and how that's a part of the journey too. But having been invited into the lives of other people has been just a tremendous blessing. As a human being, as a teacher, as a husband and a father, it's a responsibility that I certainly don't take lightly. And sometimes it is hard, but once you give yourself to the moment and you recognize what's going on right in front of you, and you can think that maybe this is going to come to fruition later on, it's really an opportunity to just love.
Yeah. Yeah. And I really hope that you have the opportunity to, I don't know how you could possibly do this, but to appreciate all of that love that's coming back to you, because it's like, I can't even imagine. For instance, thinking of, I text my friend Eric Dowds, who again was a classmate at the prep with me. And, I say, who should I interview for 180 Degrees of Impact? And he mentions you. And so there's a whole story, I'm sure, when it comes to him in terms of, just his, relationship with you, or thoughts of like how you've impacted his life. And again, he's just one other person. Between the two of us, it's two people. And there are, I would assume, millions of people that have somehow been benefited from, your message and who you are. And so I would just encourage you to keep that up. And I'm sure we could go on forever. I'm sure that we will have time to talk again soon. But I do want to ask you, as one of my last questions that I ask everyone, like looking at, Billy Ward's life, looking at your life overall, if it were a book or a documentary, I would love to know, what would that title be, and why? I mean, I imagine that maybe Love and Be Loved would be somewhere in that title, but I'm wondering, is there another title that comes to mind for you?
I think it's hard for me to go beyond that mantra, Maddie, just because it says it all to me. Love and be loved. Love yourself, others, the world, and God, and allow yourself to be loved in return. And
Yeah.
if there is one message that I want to convey, if there's one thing that I want to share with my life, it's probably just that. And I think about like my relationship with my sons, and if I only had one message to send them, that would be it, man. Just love and be loved. And it's tough for me to kind of move away from that because it's become so central to the life I'm trying to live. But also, I found that the more I commit to that, the better everything gets. And I'm kind of like a simple guy, and I like things to be good. And so the more I love, the better things are. And I think that would be my title for the book, and for my life story, and really what I'm trying to achieve while here on this earth.
Yeah. It's funny because even just listening to you throughout this conversation, like there's so many different ways you spend your time. There's so many different ways that you look at life. And I think people would really love to hear from your perspective even more than they already have. But like, in the back of my head, and you just touched on it, you said you're a simple guy. And I think a lot of what you're saying is as simple as love and be loved. And it's a little bit, it's yeah, almost jarring for me to, like, again realize that, yeah, maybe it is as simple as love and be loved. Like, it doesn't, if there's something that I had to tell someone out of this conversation, it would be that. And your life, everything you've said about your family, about how you're spending your time, about how you're looking out onto the world, really embodies that. And that's just reassuring that you have that view on life. Kind of, you have that at least that message and that mantra figured out, which is nice. And it's a reminder that, people like me or anyone who's watching should really consider bringing that into the fold in their lives.
And if something else pops up for somebody, it doesn't always have to be love and be loved, but I think you should have some kind of philosophy of life to kind of thread the everyday with, so that when you are having moments where you're not quite sure how you want to respond or react, you can always return to that idea.
Yeah.
So that you have a sense of how you want to be before you even enter the room.
Yeah. I think that's great advice. And I am definitely going to rewatch this and re-listen to it and just kind of dive deeper into it, because again, there's a lot of wisdom you have to share. And I think the way that you share it is just very calming and reassuring. And for anyone who wants to learn more about all that you're up to, where could they learn more online?
I'm glad you asked that. Right now, I am beginning to build an online community through Instagram at Billy Ward Motivation, with daily videos during the week, just to remind people a lot about what we're talking about, this desire to connect, but also this responsibility that we have to share the love in our hearts. So that's where people can find me right now, at Billy Ward Motivation. And from there, I don't know. We'll see what happens in the future, but I'm not trying to control that too much, and see what is organically going to happen.
Awesome. And if anyone wants to learn more about 180 Degrees of Impact, they could just go to lets.care or www.lets.care, at Lets You Care on social media. And yeah, I really can't thank you enough for joining. And I am looking forward to that book that you put out there, or that documentary about your life, and to see what's ahead, because you mentioned 20 years, which 20 years at the prep, which might seem like a lot, but it's, I don't know, it's a little bit surprising just looking at you. I don't see the 20 years on you, and I'm imagining maybe you could probably hang in there for another 40 or 50 years. So I'm sure we'll talk again sometime in that time that you keep sharing your message and everything. So
I sure hope so, man. I really thank you so much for the opportunity. I'm just happy that we got a chance to talk and to meet here online. And I love what you're doing too, Maddie. And I'm really proud of you. And this is just good vibes, man, everywhere.
awesome. Thanks a lot. And again, good vibes all around. And one thing I say at the end of all of these conversations, other than just thanking you for being part of this, is for you and anyone who's watching to keep impacting. I think that might be the title of my real life book or documentary, you know, one day.
Love it.
So keep impacting and keep up the great work.
Awesome, man.
Awesome. And you know, you running through the halls of the prep, but now I could see all of it.
Hey, what do you think? This is a new edition before we get started again. This is a new edition here at school.
Love and be loved. Come on. How who decided to put that there?
Well, we're doing a little project. We're putting a lot of different things up in school, a lot of seeds to plant in terms of thought. So here's another one right here. Can you see this?
Friend loves at
No,
all time.
not yet.
What's the rest of that?
Students are busting my chops.
Wow.
Here's another one. Live like a champion today. Yeah, pretty cool.
Yeah, that
So
is really cool.
School with the phone, as you know, and kids are like, "Is that Billy Ward motivation?"
That's right.
They're characters.